hello. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. We are at episode 3, the one about my book that was a highlight. But this is episode 3, and today we're going to be talking about mental wellness with a twist because we have a whole lot to get into. So, before we dive into the content, I just want to say I love you. I love all of you for tuning in, being willing to hear what it is that I have to say, spreading the word, because if you've been following me on Instagram, you know that when I first started, I was at 8 with the goal of 30 subscribers, and I'm happy to share that we're at 25. Spirit fingers, spirit fingers. Okay, listen. Not only that, the episode where I talk about men and mental health being in the same sentence received 108 views. Now, who out there sharing the word? Because I did not expect 108 views, and I am so grateful. I'm so grateful. So I just want to say thank you for spreading the word, reposting, commenting, liking, subscribing. You guys blew my mind. You blew my mind. So I am just so grateful, and I give God the honor, the glory, because if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here doing this work right now. But he called me to do this work, so here I am, paying it forward, sharing knowledge and skills with the world based off of my perspective and my experiences. So let's get into it. But before we get into mental wellness, I want to talk about stigma for a second. So as you know, I use my phone for reference purposes, so that's why you see me looking down. And I want to talk about stigma. Stigma is when someone sees you in a negative way because of a particular characteristic or attribute, such as skin color, cultural background, being differently abled, or struggling with mental illness. Essentially, it happens when a person defines someone by their illness rather than who they are as an individual. For example, they may label someone as crazy rather than a person experiencing psychosis. What are the harmful effects of stigma? Feeling shame, hopelessness, and isolation. Reluctance to ask for help or to get treatment. Lack of understanding by family, friends, or others. Being bullied or experiencing any form of violence, and self-doubt. And those are just a few stigmas. So how many of us are walking with stigmas that has allowed us to view something or someone a certain way? And how has it been helpful? Has it been, right? And then what does that stigma tell you? What is the message that you receive? People who are struggling with mental health challenges or illnesses, they may isolate themselves from the world already, right? So receiving the stigma, the bullying, for example, it's not helping that person, right? Reach out to the people. If you are struggling, reach out to people that you trust. And if you know of someone who is struggling, reach out to someone who you trust with this information, such as family, friends, coaches, or religious leaders, if you are a person who goes to church, because you need a support system. Connecting with others, so important to have a village. You're going to hear me talk about having a village throughout my videos or even in the comments, because it's so important to have a village. It's managing the feeling of isolation and can help you or another person feel like they're not alone, so you normalize the experience. And lastly, you are not your illness, and that person is not their illness, nor should they be defined by their illness. And I really like that one, because whenever we are vulnerable, that gives a person access to judge us, right? To share feedback, to share advice, right? So the moment that a person shares their vulnerabilities with you, especially when it's sensitive, try your best to not meet that with stigma, the shame, right? Or giving the space to allow that person to feel worse than they already feeling, right? So we don't want to meet that vulnerability with shame or guilt. There is something interesting about this one that I'm about to share with you, and it's to not take it personal. This one can be complicated in nature for a variety of reasons, but it's so important to not take things personal based off of what is done or said to you. And of course, you're human, so you may respond on impulse based on how that person made you feel or what they've done to you. What I would encourage in that moment after, because it takes practice, is to process, feel what you need to feel, and really think about it. And it's very hard to go through the motion of not taking it personal, especially when it's offensive and maybe it's triggering, right? So why not to take it personal is because there are people who are showing up based off of their own experiences, right? So I mean like everything, both challenges and beautiful experiences. And so when a person responds to you in a way that maybe your needs are not met, or it is disappointing in some way or upsetting, it's recognizing that we all have our own stories. We're all walking with things that are visible and things that are invisible. For your emotional wellness, it's to not take it personal. And if you do, it's one, forgiving yourself and giving yourself that grace if you respond based on taking it personal, and also being willing to see that person through a different lens. Like, you know what, I don't know what this person is going through, so blank blank, right? And it's recognizing that we're all going through stuff when we're interacting with folks. And so you may be greeted with a harsh response, not intended, or maybe intended. And at the same time, it's recognizing that you have a decision to make. You have to say, okay, am I going to accept this, or I'm not going to accept this? And if I'm not going to accept this or accept it, how am I going to respond to this, right? Ensuring that your wellness is okay. This is something that is going to take some practice. It's not something that will happen overnight, because sometimes things can catch us off guard and we can't take things personal. And I'm a victim of this too, and it's recognizing that people can really show up through the capacity that they can and at the capacity that you think that they can. So challenging stigma associated specifically with mental illness. Everyone has a role to play in creating a mentally healthy community, one that is inclusive, rejects discrimination, and supports recovery. What are ways to help? Learning more about mental illnesses and mental health on a whole, and sharing them with family, friends, work colleagues, and or classmates, and or even strangers, right? Getting to know people. Oh, very important. Getting to know people and learning about them versus making assumptions. Because where does assumptions lead up to? What does it lead up to? And it's really recognizing that it can create more assumptions, it can grow and then lead to maybe a harmful effect in the long run. So getting to know people is very important. Not to make the assumptions, asking the questions that you are curious about in, of course, a genuine way, and being willing to hear, right? It may not be something that you agree with per se, but just welcoming that space is going to allow the stigma to decrease. Why? Because now you're not being judgmental. You're like, hey, you know what? I don't know much about you. I want to know about you on a deeper level, or at least to the level that you'd like for me to gain access to you, right? And not judging. That's the third tip. Not judging, labeling, or discriminating when you meet someone who's struggling with a mental illness. First of all, we all know what judgment feels like, right? And we also know what it feels like to be heard, to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be respected, to be celebrated, right? So I encourage to think about meeting this person in the way that you'd like to be met, right? Avoiding using language that puts the illness first and the person second. And this means like when you meet someone struggling, but also like if you're struggling too, it's recognizing that the language that you speak towards yourself is important. It's just as important, almost most important, right? And so it's seeing the person for who they are, as authentic as they are, and straying away from using insensitive language, and even asking questions like, is it okay if I say this, right? Or, okay, does this offend you, right? So asking the questions, the necessary questions, especially if you don't know where to gauge, right? Because people value that. You're saying, right, you're putting yourself in the position of being a student, and you're saying, you know what, I don't know this. I want to know this. Correct me, right? So being a student ongoingly. Saying something when you hear people around you making a stereotypical or inaccurate comment about mental illnesses. And even if you are in a position where you're not in a place of fully understanding, right? Because we don't know everything, right? And we only know a certain amount of information as of right now. And so if you feel like the language or comments that people are using around a mental illness, I'm saying to voice your opinion, right? Challenging the language, the comments, because going back to people only seeing things through their capacity, right? Their experiences, their story. It's recognizing that a person may not be aware, and they may be using language or saying things based off of, their own experiences and their perception and their own stigmas, their own beliefs. And so it's not saying you're going to attack them. It's saying, well, hey, I heard you say something today, and it's also not always what you do is how you do it, right? So pulling the person aside, for example, and bringing it to their awareness and saying, like, just being careful. Now, here's the thing. It's up to the person to decide the way that they want to decide, right? That is a part that you have to release, because that's not within your control. And they may respond defensively, right? Because now, like, you're challenging them, like you're challenging this belief that they've carried. And how dare you challenge me, right? In a sort of way. So you may be greeted with like a person who's willing to learn, or you may be greeted with someone who may be resistant, right? And it's recognizing that resistance is common, because sometimes we're resistant to change, right? In general. And so you're like essentially changing their mindset about something. So like the immediate or impulsive response may be like, oh, how dare you, right? And it's also giving that person time to digest it and deciding for yourself that you've done your part. And then if you are a person who struggle with a mental illness yourself, right, or know of someone, right, it's like sharing your own experiences, right? Telling your story. Hey, I've struggled, or I know of a person who struggled, because you might be there normalizing an experience, yet also empowering a person to share their story also, and or to seek support. So this is just a little bit about stigma. Now, I want to talk about cultural stigma. And I want to talk about this because it's near and dear to my heart as a person from the Caribbean, and recognizing that we didn't talk about mental health as a community. And though now is different, right? Because now there's more awareness, there is still a stigma there, right? For some people. And I remember learning about mental health when I came to Connecticut. I remember learning about different types of disorders. And I don't like to use that word. I'm very sensitive about that, because I feel like, when you hear disorder, you immediately can feel like there's something wrong. And I'm just here to share with anyone as you're watching. If you are a person who is struggling with mental health challenges, and I usually use that word, it's recognizing that you are not your illness, and If you're a person who is unsure, but you know that there's something there, you're not your illness. You're not. Okay. And so I prefer the term mental health challenges for everyday term. People do use mental health disorder, but I prefer mental health challenges. So me coming here as a native from St. Croix, I remember having an aha moment when I first learned about depression, when I first learned about anxiety. And I'm hearing, that people within marginalized communities uh, face these challenges more than any other community. And I'm like, I'm a part of this, right? And why have I not heard about depression? Just the term. Didn't hear about the terms. And while I was doing my own research, because now I'm like having this aha moment, I'm like, I need to do some more work on this. Went ahead and I researched and I gathered information about, mental health and marginalized communities, being a Caribbean woman, and just kind of like filling in the gaps, the questions that I had. And I thought, I've experienced sadness before. I felt nervous before, and it was almost like foreign, right? And so many of us come from cultural backgrounds where it's foreign. We don't talk about the symptoms, neither do we talk about the challenges, right? The mental health challenges and going to therapy and just kind of like all of the different conversations within mental health. And so when I got here, I decided to do something about it. Yet I also recognized that there was a cultural stigma that I carried that I wanted to address, right? So I want to talk about how culture affects mental health in a way that it can be harmful, right? And it speaks to the stigma. And it's one of those things where like you may find that you're like me, where you have to do the work alone and you have to do the research alone to fill in the gaps and fill in the questions that you may have about mental health. So for some people, and this is research that I'm gathering, so I'm looking and referencing at the same time. For some people, making an appointment with a mental health provider may be a personal and independent decision. For others, the decision to seek therapy services may be influenced by their culture or community, as for many people, culture has its own understanding, interpretation, and beliefs around mental health symptoms and overall mental health. What is it about culture in reference to mental health? So our own culture teaches us ways to cope with distress. Whether, as I was mentioning, right, whether the language is there, whether the terms is there, our culture teaches us how to cope, right, with distressing events and or stress, right? And it also teaches us who to rely on or what to rely on during difficult times. This may also impact the way that a person perceives mental health services and treatment, or the decision to not seek it at all, right? So in many cultures like mine, Caribbean culture, negative stigma about mental health symptoms or therapy services is a major obstacle to getting professional help, right? Research shows people within marginalized communities are less likely to seek therapy compared to other communities, okay? So we're talking about Black communities, Caribbean communities, Hispanic communities, Asian communities, and other marginalized communities. Many marginalized groups are more comfortable going to their primary care physicians or family members for assistance. I was one of those people, right? And though that is helpful, it's also recognizing that sometimes you need another perspective, right? And I can't wait to talk about therapy in a few, but this may be at the ending of the video. So stay tuned. Stay with me. Okay. Opposed to speaking with a mental health provider, right? So I'm going to pause here because I have a reflection question, and it is, what were the languages used around mental health? If there were languages used around mental health. When did you first discover mental health? When did you need it the most? And also recognizing, if you are a person who are engaging in therapy, what were the differences that you noticed seeking a mental health provider versus seeking your family for support, right? We all want to be accepted by our communities, and sometimes fear, shame, or embarrassment would prevent us from seeking mental health treatment. And many of you know that I'm a provider, right? And I'm also a person. I'm a person first. And it's recognizing that me being a provider, I'm speaking to, recognizing that there are times where I'm connecting with a person from a marginalized community, and there are things that resonate with me, right? My client is sharing something with me about their experiences as it pertains to therapy, especially when it's the first time in therapy. And I'm like, oh, let's talk about that. Let's talk about, you know, uh, how are you feeling about being here? And like family systems that had contributed to maybe your perceptions of therapy, and like also what do you need, right? And how can I make this process different for you? And it's one of those things where I ask those questions, and there are many questions that I ask, right, as it pertains to pursuing therapy for the first time as a marginalized person, because coming is a big deal. And I say that all the time. Like, coming to therapy is a big deal. It's recognizing that you're like being brave enough to face things that maybe you buried for so long. And like you're seeking someone who can support you through this, yet it may become very uncomfortable because you're tackling things like stigma, right? Belief systems and attitudes that may have prevented you from seeking therapy in the first place. And then now it's saying, okay, I'm going to unlearn some things. I'm going to relearn some things. I'm going to learn some new things, right? And it's all happening uh, in a beautiful yet challenging way through seeking therapy. And so I take that I take my role very seriously, as far as, recognizing that marginalized persons we've had a different experience, right? Historically. And so it has led to where we are now in our perceptions of therapy, right? And just mental health all around. So this is what the data is telling us. Black families may be understandably reluctant to seek mental health therapy due to the long standing history of discrimination, racism, and mistreatment within the Black community. And this includes relationships with providers in the US or providers in general, right? And so what happens within Black communities is that they may take an active approach in handling adversities or difficult times independently and directly, right? And so with that is there may be more ties to spiritual resources and family support for emotional support, right? And so this would hinder a person from the Black community from being willing to pursue the service because of the understandable experiences that has been negative and harmful in so many different ways, but also like recognizing that it's valid. It's just one of those things where like it is okay to be fearful, right? It's okay to be fearful about pursuing therapy or even talking about your mental health or how you're feeling. Okay, your feelings matter. Your feelings matter. You're not a person who, is not going to experience emotional difficulties, because you're not exempt from that. You're a person. You're a person. And if you feel stifled in any way, I just want you to know that you deserve to seek support, whether it's through a mental health provider or right, a variety of different resources, right? And let's talk about the Hispanic community. So within the Hispanic culture, families are also less likely to trust mental health providers. And really and truly, what the research is telling us is that individuals from this community do tell others about their experiences with stress and or difficulties, though there is focus on physical symptoms such as trouble sleeping, loss of appetite, And there is not as much conversation about the thoughts and or feelings that are bothering them. And now we're at Asian and Middle Eastern American communities. So there is cultural belief that seeking mental health treatment will bring shame and dishonor to the family, leading to some people internalizing their symptoms instead of seeking therapy, right? Many Asian American children have described feeling pressure to appear perfect and successful, and therefore their symptoms are kept a secret. Now, this is not limited to this community only, because many other marginalized communities may also experience this simultaneously, in addition to the things that are already being said, right? And for continuing on, for Middle Eastern American adolescents, research has found that they tend to seek support from other family and religious community members. How many of us also relate to that who are non-Middle Eastern Americans, right? Or non-Asian Americans. And so all of these things I'm sharing with you is to recognize that culture, first of all, is important, right? And how that can be transferred can be, it can be beautiful, yet it can also carry stigma, right? Because I love my culture. There's nothing you could tell me to come prevent me from going back home and being amongst my people. At the same time, it's recognizing that there were stigmas that I carried, that I had to do some inner work. I had to recognize that there are things that I needed to do in order to combat the stigma, right? And it includes gathering research and connecting with other professionals and doing my own work as a professional to gain insight into me. Okay. And it took some time. So I will tell you, it doesn't happen overnight, right? Because when you have carried something for so long, like stigma, and it comes from your culture, you feel a certain kind of way, like, you're doing a dishonor to your community by changing the narrative, by changing the language, from embracing something that isn't normal or common, right? Just some things to consider, things that I discovered. And so what happens ultimately within marginalized communities is that there is a distrust. There is a distrust in seeking mental health support, talking about mental health in general, talking about things that are bothersome, right? Because there is pressures from the stigmas and also including the internal stigma. Okay. How many of our stigmas and belief systems, personal, cultural, societal, how many of it has contributed to the way that we perceive professional care seeking? And not just mental health, but just providers in general. Our current mental health status, right? And behaviors that we're engaging in, right? So how many of us are struggling, or not just struggling, but is aware of how our stigmas and our belief system can contribute to our behaviors and health practices, including mental health practices. So I want to take some more time and talk about types of mental health stigma. Okay. There is self-stigma, the internalized negative attitudes and ideas that a person maintains about oneself as a result of their mental health condition, right? And we talked about ways to alleviate that or decrease that, reduce that. Public stigma. So the societal disapproval, prejudice, and discrimination faced by individuals with mental health conditions from the general public. That is public stigma. Stigma by association is another one. The negative judgments and stereotypes individuals face due to their association with someone who has a mental health condition. Now we have systemic stigma, and we touched base on this a little bit. The pervasive and institutionalized discrimination against individuals with mental health conditions within social systems, policies, and institutions. And though I can certainly get into all of this deeper, I just want to highlight that there are different stigmas that we carry that is conscious and also that we're not aware of, right? We're aware of some of them and then we're not aware of some of them, right? What happens though is that it tends to show up in our behaviors and and also, yes, it does present in our attitudes and our perceptions of people and things and situations. It also shows up in our behaviors, right? So like, whether we choose to pursue therapy, whether we choose to share that we're struggling. And it doesn't have to do with therapy at all, just kind of like things that are day to day, like interacting with people whom we care about, right? Like, are we sharing that we're struggling, or are we masking it, right? Are we being vulnerable, or are we feeling like we can't be vulnerable, so we have to take it all in by ourselves and carry it by ourselves? Those are behavioral things. Barriers within culture, very briefly, because I feel like this is important. Now we're going to talk about generational trauma. And I'm not going to spend too much time on talking about generational trauma. However, I do want to say that it intersects to the stigma that we carry, right? So what does that look like? Let's start with our grandparents. Our grandparents may have experienced war, extreme poverty, being a migrant, experiencing domestic violence, struggling with access to education, PTSD for a variety of reasons, dysfunctional family dynamics, dysfunctional relationships, for example, right? And we cannot ignore slavery, right? And so now those are things that were not addressed because we also didn't discover mental health more, or that it didn't become more apparent until later on, right? Now we're here to our parents. It's transferred, right? These are things that are not addressed, and now it's transferred to our parents. So what does that look like? Abuse, more poverty, alcoholism, being physically unavailable, spending too much time away from family because they're working, for example. Emotional challenges, so a person or your parents struggling with emotional intelligence or emotional awareness, emotional vocalization and or articulation, emotional expression, right? Getting married without establishing financial stability, more patriarchy, continuously creating a dysfunctional family, being overly protective, divorcing, unfortunately, more domestic violence, and connecting with partners who are emotionally unavailable, and or having a partner where there is incompatibility. Now you have us, the children, and we are struggling with attachment issues, childhood trauma, more poverty, abuse, unfortunately, more DV, PTSD, challenges with self-identity, being in toxic relationships, being in narcissistic relationships, depression, alcoholism, people-pleasing, low self-esteem, challenges with health due to trauma, mistrust, hypervigilance, survival mode, fight or flight responses, wounded masculinity and femininity, lack of boundaries, nightmares, and feeling unlovable. And the list can go on and on for each category. Why I'm sharing this is because our history, our family history, our generational history has an impact on our stigma, the stigmas that we carry, the attitudes that we have, the perceptions that we have, the beliefs that we have, the practices that we have. And so it's recognizing that the reason why I'm sharing this insight into this is because if you're watching this, when you do watch this, you can be the generational breaker. Now, that can be pressuring for some people, right? At the same time, it's recognizing that it's unfair for the next generation to experience this, right? And who knows what that's going to look like, right? And so we have to intervene now. We have to change the way that we do things now. We have to tackle those stigmas. We have to talk about things that are uncomfortable. We have to talk about things that we've normalized that should not be normalized, right? We have to change the language around mental health because we matter, our parents matter, our grandparents matter, right? And then our future generations matter. So what are we doing now to help prepare the next generation? Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about therapy, mental health challenges. I want to talk about mental health issues, and mental illness. So we're going to differentiate between the three. What is mental health? The capacity to think, feel, and act in ways that enhance our ability to enjoy life and to deal with challenges. Mental health issues. It is decreased capacities, whether it's cognitive, emotional, attentional, and etc., that interfere with enjoyment of life, interactions with society, and our environment. And now we have mental illness. Conditions that affect a person's thinking, feeling, mood, and or behavior, including depression, anxiety, or PTSD. And those are just a few, right? So we want to make sure that we understand the difference between all three, especially as it pertains to understanding the realm of mental health and thinking about therapy, which we're going to talk about shortly. For today, I do want to challenge the stigma and use the language of mental wellness. So, mental wellness is an internal resource that helps us think, feel, connect, and function. It's an active process that helps us to build resilience, grow, and flourish. Mental wellness is a resource and it is a process, right? It is not a static state of being. And we'll talk about what I mean by that shortly. So, this definition looks at mental wellness as a dynamic, renewable, and positive resource, and as an active process that requires initiative and conscious action. It recognizes that mental wellness as an internal experience that encompasses how we think, how we process, how we understand, and how we use information, how we feel, how we manage and express our emotions, how we connect and our relationship with others, how we act or function, or how we put pieces together. Taking external inputs along with our internal capacity and then making decisions or doing things. Mental wellness is sometimes associated with the concept of psychological well-being, which includes self-acceptance, growth, purpose, autonomy, environmental mastery, and positive relationships. Mental wellness has been described as a process, a resource, a state of being, or a balance point between resources and challenges. So I'm going to stop here because it's so important to recognize that when we start to tackle stigma, we have to also recognize that mental health, therapy, anything revolving mental health, it's one of those things where we have to identify with things that would allow us to feel like it's okay to challenge the stigma, right? So I don't want to jump right into therapy right now. And I didn't earlier because I feel as though we have to unpack these things to then gain insight into what is therapy and what does that look like. So mental wellness also has a horizontal axis. It measures mental illnesses or challenges from high to low. This axis measures the presence or absence of diagnosable mental health challenges such as anxiety, depression, and or personality disorders, and much more. And this is usually derived or supported through seeking a mental health professional. There is a vertical axis, which this axis captures the many factors that shape our overall mental health and well-being. This looks like stress, worry, loneliness, sadness, looking at happiness, life satisfaction, building strong relationships, or personal growth, right? And this looks at preventing the illness, right? Intervening, so a little bit of public health here, maintaining good mental health, and pursuing optimal mental well-being, right? Now, hearing this may create a lot of pressure, and I encourage you to not feel pressured because it's essentially saying, hey, mental health is multidimensional. It's not just about seeking a therapist because there's something, or you think that there's something wrong with you, because there's nothing wrong with anybody, right? We are all beings who are functioning, and there are things that we can deal with, and there's some things that we just cannot, and we need extra support, and that's okay, right? There's nothing wrong with you. Okay, so I like this part that highlights that a lack of mental illness does not equate to mental wellness. Okay. Um, so about 15% of the world's population suffers from a diagnosed mental or substance use disorder, but that doesn't mean that the other 85% of the population is mentally well or leading healthy, happy, productive, and satisfied lives. And I want to highlight this to tackle the stigma, because there is a misconception that people who are not seeking therapeutic services are fine. Many of us are here living undiagnosed, right? Many of us are living without the support of someone who is a mental health professional, right? Many of us are just kind of like living and surviving, and so that doesn't take away, or that doesn't negate the fact that though you may not be seeking a therapist, that doesn't mean that you're not struggling, right? So we're going to continuously challenge the stigma here, right? We're all people, and so we're susceptible to things that would occur, and that we're not exempt from them, even if we think so, right? Now, we can manage them differently. It doesn't mean that we're exempt, because we also have to face this thing which is called life, right? And so it can be complicated in nature. So how do we move through that? And if we need someone, that extra oomph, that's okay. Please keep in mind that mental wellness can coexist with mental illness. So research on the dual continuum model shows that the presence of mental illness does not necessarily imply an absence of mental wellness, and vice versa, right? And so a person can demonstrate a positive mental wellness, so they have great relationships, feeling happy, and they're functioning in all of the things that they're doing, and still struggle with depression and or anxiety, right? Just a reminder that mental wellness is an active process of moving, languishing, to resilience, to flourishing. It's not a constant state, because you're human. Probably tired of me saying that, but it's true, right? You can't constantly be in a state of happiness all of the time. And what I mean by that is that, yes, you can definitely be happy multiple times throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the month, often, yes. And it's also recognizing that you're being honest with how you're feeling, and being honest with yourself, most importantly, and then being able to show up in a world where you're not masking, right? Because we can mask to the point where we can really believe that we're happy, and then we push away the things that we really need to address just for the sake of remaining happy. And though being happy can be your resilient action, it's also recognizing that sometimes you need to unpack things, and that is important for healing. Okay, so now we're going to dive into therapy, lo and behold. So what do people think therapy is? I saw this awesome diagram that had like a circle. I'm going to try to show it. Oops. Okay, can't see. Cool. So there is a diagram where the circle is filled with, the full circle is filled with talking about your problems to a therapist. And I can't tell you how often I hear this, right? But what therapy actually is talking about your problems to a therapist, yes. Psychological education, psychoeducation, if you will, between session tasks, whether it's texting and or emailing and coordinating, building awareness of your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, making changes to your thoughts and behaviors, learning and practicing coping strategies and or other skills, right? So let's talk about what therapy is not for a second. So I love the fact that like there is more awareness of therapy on like shows that I've been watching and like movies, and just kind of like raising the awareness of this experience, right? Therapeutic experience. At the same time, it's not exactly always what you see. So you may find like there is some stigmatizing acts, right, that then can discourage a person from attending therapy, like a person who might be, you know, wearing like a helmet, you know, going through like shock therapy. No. Or like when like a person is in the space and this is the provider is also like, you know, confessing their own issues to the client, and it's just now becoming a part of like it becomes the provider's session. Like, it's humorous, questionable, and also like, though I've seen like maybe a few shows that like highlighted how the therapy process can look like, which I love. It's also recognizing that the only way you're gonna have the true experience is if you try it. What therapy is not. It is not a place to get fixed. I will tell you that, and it goes to the stigma, right? Like, you know, the language used around going to therapy because there's something wrong with you. We have to tackle the stigma, the internal, the cultural, the societal, the public, I mean, interpersonal, familial. We have to target the stigma, because when a person engages in therapy, it's not because something is wrong with you. You're not crazy, right? How common is that language, right? It's one of those things where like therapy is multidimensional. You can be talking about a condition, right? And we're utilizing our texts, the DSM-5, and it can range from that to talking about, you know, drama with your bestie. Like, that's just really the nature of therapy. It's pretty organic. I consider it as organic because you just never know what the session is going to look like unless we plan for it. And even if we do plan for the next session to look like blah, it doesn't exactly turn out that way all the time. You are not broken. No, I'll be the first one to say it. You're not broken. Therapy is a process, and you know, the therapist should not be, you know, telling you exactly what to do with your life, right? Because for me, right, my style is, you're the captain. I'm just here. You know, I'm here with you as we're on this ship together. And you know what? I'm gonna throw some tools out there to you, and you let me know which one works and which one doesn't work, and we're gonna try to implement them and see how it turns out, right? So essentially, offering support. Therapy is not a place where you have to share everything all of the time. Ooh, this is a good one. This is a good one. I love this one because I will tell you, I've had, you know, clients who will share with me like, yeah, I just want to sit here. Can we play a game? Oh, yes, we can play a game. Let's play Uno. You know, let's have fun, right? Like, let's not speak, because sometimes it is exhausting to speak, right? And it's so exhausting to revisit, you know, emotions that are heavy or experiences that are heavy. So what happens is that, okay, well, you know what? For today, if we don't want to talk about our problems and we just want to play Uno, let's play Uno. You don't have to share everything with your therapist if you don't want to. Your comfort is important, most important. You can if you want to, right? Your therapist will build that openness with you, that rapport, and, you know, would leave for you to be vulnerable, right? Um, and the goal would be that through the rapport and building of trust, that, you know, there is a place and there's a season where, you know, we're open and we're honest and we're transparent, you know, with each other in this space. Therapy is not going to be heavy all the time, you know, so there may be times where like we're talking about ways to get through, or we're talking about like heavy family stuff, right, that are traumatizing. And though that might be something that occurs in one session, it may not be occurring in the next one or the next one after that. And so like, again, like, we can be talking about family trauma, and then we can also like take a break from that and then talk about like, what's your favorite color, what have you been doing this weekend, self-care, you know, just kind of like recognizing that it doesn't have to be heavy, because feeling heavy things doesn't always feel good. Even though you're there for support, doesn't mean that you are ready to talk about the heaviness all of the time, right? And like, there should be balance in the therapeutic process. Therapy is not on a specific timeline. It is a process. It is not linear. It's not a straight line. Therapy has no defined timeline. It's just there. And I say that it's a supportive process. There's no rush. Let's take our time. Let's go through this process, right? And sometimes it can be uncomfortable. It can be uncomfortable to go through because maybe of having that internal time frame, right? At the same time, you don't deserve the heaviness, that burden, that time burden, right? So going through the process is so important, and recognizing that you get there, you'll achieve that goal that you have. And it's also recognizing that you're coming in with stuff that were normalized for so long, and so we're also like unnormalizing things, right? And so like we're like simultaneously learning and then unlearning at the same time, right? And like changing things around through practice, and recognizing that like practice also takes time. And so we may be practicing a skill in therapy. Now it's to take it outside, and it's like, okay, well, you're trying, and then like it's uncomfortable. Like, so it's really not linear. It's really a process, right? Oh, I have to give a shout out to millennials and Gen Z, because they're the ones who have been talking more openly about mental health. And within the last decade, therapy has become more common and less stigmatized, even though there's still stigma, right? Yet, millennials and Gen Zers have been open with their grandparents and parents, about like struggling with depression and anxiety and other mental illnesses. And essentially, this has just been super helpful. And though this has been super helpful, we still have ongoing work to do, right? And so millennials and Gen Zers, shout out to y'all. Mwah. I give you credit, because we do need to have these conversations, and we need to be challenging years of like stifling, right? And being more open and willing to share about struggles, because even though maybe your grandparents or parents have not talked about their struggles, they struggled. It's more so of them possessing the skills that would have allowed them to be okay with expressing, right? So like, or like not being okay, right? Being comfortable with not being okay, because that's a whole different thing, right? And also having the tools, right? Having the access, the education, the insurance, right? All of which are important. So what are things that therapy is not continuously? Therapy is not a one size fits all. Nope. Nope, nope, nope. Me personally, I view my approach through a cultural lens. So, and of course, other systems, but through truly an eclectic approach, honing mostly in on culture. And so I recognize that culture can influence everything, and it shapes us in a variety of different ways. And so, like, how I may be supporting Bill may not be the same way that I would support Mary, right? Because of their own experiences and their own authentic lives, right? Their own authenticity. And also recognizing that though I may think that one strategy may work for Bill, it may not work for Mary, and vice versa. And so it's really creative in nature. Therapy is pretty creative, and it is a science, yet it's also an art. And so it's recognizing that the approach should be based on the person, right? And also recognizing that a person may possess different values from the other person. And so it's really about learning about the client, and learning about what their needs are, and learning about who they are and where they're coming from and where they're headed, right? All of which that are encompassing, right? Therapy is also not right for everyone. So what do I mean by that? I mean by there are people who may have had terrible experiences with therapy, and so it might be overwhelming to return to it. Or a person may not be ready, right? I would always suggest preparing emotionally to head into therapy, and not in an overwhelming, daunting kind of way, but in a way that like it really does take readiness, because it's looking inward in a way that's never been seen before, right? And maybe has been seen before. Instead, now you're in a room with someone whom you don't know, and so it's a little bit different, right? You're learning about this person just as much as they're learning about you. And so like it's recognizing that, it's not saying that you're never going to be ready. It's saying that, hey, I have to be ready for this. I have to be ready to do the work. And when I say the work, I mean like the internal stuff, even the external stuff too, like drawing boundaries with people, right? And so how uncomfortable that can be. It's not accessible to everyone. Access to education, access to resources, socioeconomic status, right? How important are all of these things when it comes to mental health? They are important. Therapy can be expensive, y'all. It can be. And so it's recognizing that, like, a person may not even know where to look for a professional or where to seek services or how to ask, right? So we have to consider those things, right? Therapy is an hour. It really depends, right? An hour, for example, in your week, right? That leaves like everything else outside of therapy that you have to manage, right? You're in charge, okay? And so you get to decide, like, will this apply to my life or will it not? You may not receive everything in therapy. The goal is hopefully to receive something, right? We also want you to have a village because you need the support. You deserve the support. You don't deserve to carry things by yourself. And it's not saying sharing everything with everybody because you don't have to. It's saying to find someone that you can trust, find an outlet, right? A creative outlet and things that would allow you to thrive in the way that you'd want to, right? Or connect in a way that you want to. And also, therapy is not immune from systemic oppression. So discrimination, racism, stereotyping, homophobia, gender discrimination, ableism. I mean, you name it. Okay. We're not immune. The therapeutic process is not immune from systemic oppression. And it's recognizing that it can be pretty harmful during the process if you're exposed. And so it's recognizing that, one, you don't deserve that, right? Therapy is designed to be a safe space. And so if you find that you're experiencing any of the following things, it's also recognizing that you may have to change therapists, right? And that's okay, because therapy should be a safe space, which means that it should feel healing, right? And safe and free of judgment and compassion and understanding. And empathy. People have their own stuff, right? Therapists have their own stuff. And just like stigma, there's biases, right? And so it's recognizing that, if it's going to be harmful for you, if the process is going to be harmful, honey, it may be time to reevaluate and change your therapist. Or I would suggest to talk about it with your therapist. And now it's making a decision from there, depending on how your therapist respond, right? Because you want to make sure that you're in a space where you can be honest and transparent too, especially because the therapeutic process is about you. So I want to make sure you're safe in that way. It should be seen as a process. It should be seen as a process, not used as the way to ridicule anyone or bring shame or guilt in any way, no matter what it is. So lastly, I want to say that therapy is not a lifetime commitment. There are people who graduate from therapy. They've learned how to manage certain things, right? And they can continue without receiving that additional support. It doesn't mean that they can't come back, because they can. It's just that, you know what? I don't need you as much as I did in the beginning, and I'm okay now. I got this, And so people do graduate from therapy. You can go in and out of therapy throughout different periods of your life. You may not always want a partner or a guide for your mental health, and that's okay. You are free to decide whether you'd like a professional to help you or support you or not. That's okay. Okay. Want to make sure that you connected with someone who is the best fit for you. It's about you. So we want to make sure you're comfortable most and first and foremost, right? And so it's trusting your gut and how you feel with them. And your struggle is real just as much as anyone else's challenges. And it's not fair should you minimize your experiences because it's not as bad as someone. So once you start talking through challenges, feelings, and thoughts, even if you're uncomfortable, you'll soon realize that your therapists are having a normal conversation with you, right? While validating your experiences and maybe even giving support or even asking questions, right? And that kind of validation can be empowering and liberating. This should be and is a space where you can break down your barriers. So when issues go unaddressed, we have a tendency to ruminate on those experiences, and it can lead to interesting thoughts, right? That may not be helpful, right? And not just about ourselves, but even about the situation and the people who are involved, right? It can be difficult to create relationships such as friends, family, or partnerships and or co-workerships, right? When it can really be deeply rooted in something stemming from childhood and or trauma, right? And it's something that we can be aware of and some things that we may not be aware of, right? So therapy is really designed to break down your barriers, the walls that you've had up for 20 years, right? This would be the time where, and of course, there's no rush to it. It's really a process. Therapy is like multi-dimensional and an art and a science. And so like I'm saying these are the things that therapy is, and also it's like recognizing that it's authentic in its own self, right? So like it depends on who you're working with and who you are and what your values are, your personality, and just a variety of different things, right? And what you need, right? What you're heading into therapy for. Work. Yes, it is. Work as in like internal and external. Why? Because there might be some changes that need to occur. And remember earlier when I was saying that naturally we're resistant to change, maybe like off the bat, and then afterwards we're like, oh, okay, I can do this. We may meet therapy in that way, right? Especially when like someone is saying like, hey, you know what, how about like you change? I think that you should consider changing, or you should consider exploring your friendship group. And these are friends that you've been with for 30 years. And here is this person saying, I think maybe you should reevaluate them based on what you shared, right? And so like you might be finding yourself in a hard place. You're like, I've known them for 30 years and also like they're hurting me. What do I do? Right? So it's like uncomfortable, right? And so it's one of those things where like therapy takes place, and I say this all the time. Therapy takes place in and out of the session. The hour we spent together, yes, very important. At the same time, we'd want to also see change happening within your environment and within yourself, right? With time, right? There isn't no immediate thing that is meant to occur. It shouldn't be occurring immediately. I mean, unless it does. I'm like, okay. But like, there isn't no expectation for things to change immediately either. Still, like, hearing a suggestion still might be uneasy, right? So, yes, it takes some work. And being intentional, right, about you, right? And your goals and what you'd like to see. What does that look like for you? If you had it your way, what would your life look like, right? And so like, and though there is no such thing as perfection, we all have this image in our heads where we're like, I want to see myself doing this, right? And so like that kind of question, where do you see yourself, right? And so it's work. It's uncomfortable at times, yet also rewarding too. So I don't want to like not encourage you to pursue therapy because it's uncomfortable that you have to do work, but it's actually one of those things where like though it's uncomfortable, it can be rewarding at the same time. You can feel both of those things, discomfort and happiness. Yes, you can. I'm taking this from Good Therapy. What is therapy? Therapy, also called psychotherapy or counseling or talk therapy, is a process of meeting with the therapist to resolve problematic behaviors, beliefs, feelings, relationship issues, and or somatic responses, sensations in the body. Beginning therapy can be a big step toward being the healthiest version of yourself and living the best life possible, no matter what challenges you may be facing. Through therapy, you can change harmful behaviors and and habits, resolve painful feelings, improve your relationships, and much more. I love this definition. It gives what therapy is in a nutshell. I just want to remind everyone that it's also about building skills. Let's say maybe you struggle with emotional articulation. We can spend 2 sessions practicing emotional articulations. Yes, we can maybe spend 1 session talking about, maybe what were contributions to not being emotionally articulate. Okay, cool. And then the next 2, we're like, okay, we're going to practice. We're going to do some role playing. You're going to pretend like I am your friend and you're going to express to me things that I've done to you that you didn't like, or things that I've done to you that you love. And then we go with that. And so it's really an art. I can't stress this enough. It really is an art. There is science in there. For me, I feel as though like therapy should be inclusive, and I wanted to be creative, and I wanted to have the science, go through the text and everything, and at the same time like being able to like draw in a session and just listen to music and we're just not saying anything, right? And so like just being within the organicness, the authenticity of it all, and working with your therapist to engage and explore skills that you'd want to learn, like communication, conflict resolution, right? Anger management. So like all of these things, right? It can be skills building. The process in itself is multidimensional, and so it does involve different types of therapeutic approaches. There are different modes of therapy, depending on the therapist and depending on what you need at the time. That's really essential in a therapeutic process. At the same time, it's also recognizing what you need and knowing what it is that you need from the therapeutic process. And if you're feeling like those needs are not being met, it's okay to voice them. Okay, so there are different types of therapeutic approaches, such as individual therapy, which can look like being able to improve communication skills, help you feel empowered, empower you to develop fresh insights about your life, and learning how to make healthier choices, for example, and maybe even developing coping strategies to manage stress. There is family therapy, where, you look at also improving communication skills, collaborating with family members, developing individual coping strategies, and identifying ways to function as a family unit. There is couples therapy, where you can also work on improving communication skills, resolving conflict, restoring lost trust, increase shared support, restoring intimacy, learning how to support each other through difficult times, and forming a stronger bond. These are just examples, right? Truly, it's recognizing that you can voice these things in therapy. Like if you're doing individual therapy and like maybe you have a aha moment, right? And you're like, you know what, I think my mom can benefit from this, and you want to pull mom in, you can do that. You can absolutely have a discussion with your therapist about this, right? Or your partner, right? You can actually include them, because when it comes to therapy, it being integrative or multidimensional, is recognizing that, we need to connect with our clients' support system too, right? Or their relationships, important relationships. How to find a therapist. Very important. So when people are recruiting me, and when I say recruiting me, there is a wonderful website called Psychology Today. Highly recommend, by the way. That's where like clients are able to recruit me, and they'll like email me and let me know, hey, I'm interested in pursuing therapy. I know finding the right therapist is not limited to the therapeutic approach. It's also inclusive of what you'd like your therapist to look like. So if you would like someone who's Black and is a woman, that is important. If that is what is going to make you most comfortable in session, is so important. Maybe a particular age group, right? Also important. And you can definitely, or maybe like a specialty area, an area that maybe you want the therapist to work on with you, because that's something that is up their alley, right? Like talking about like Caribbean related challenges, right? So maybe you're looking for a therapist who's from the Caribbean, for example, right? So all of the characteristics are important. Demographics is important, and we want to make sure that the therapeutic space is safe for you, right? And not triggering, right? Because the existence or even the gender of a person can be triggering, and we want the space to be safe. We want this space to be free of judgment, and we want this space to be filled with empathy, And not saying that a person who you connect with, who maybe not exactly what you're looking for, may not be able to provide those things to you. It's also recognizing that it's okay to voice like, hey, I want a Black therapist, or hey, I want a therapist who is a member of the LGBTQ plus community, right? And etc. Okay, so how to find a therapist. And oh, make sure you do a lot of research, right? Like questions oh, by the way, you can ask your therapist questions that you need to ask, right? So like ask questions that are important to you. Like, do you believe in God, right? If that is a value of yours, ask the question. That's okay, right? And it depends on the therapist. They may answer the question. That's an indicator that like, hey, this is something that may be of importance, or could potentially harm the session. So, maybe you're a person who's asking me that because you're not a person who believes in God. At the same time, again, it doesn't mean that though I believe in God, that the therapeutic process may not be effective, but rather, it's one of those things where if believing in God is a value to you, then I'd want to have a conversation about that, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these things matter. The experience should be safe. I can't emphasize that enough. And you should feel like you can speak to this person, to the therapist. Okay. Okay. So resources: the American Psychological Association, Good Therapy, Psychology Today, the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapists, Association of Gay and Lesbian Psychiatrists, BetterHelp, Therapy Tribe, Rehab Locator, Talkspace, Try Online Counseling, and you can even connect with your insurance company. And these are just some resources that I have. However, there's so many out there, right? And it's growing, which I love to see. So you know what? I say go for it. This is the ending of this episode for today. And I want to say thank you guys for tuning in. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share your thoughts, maybe share insight into like resources that have been helpful for you as you navigated through your own stigmas and locating a therapist. Maybe someone else relates to that, and you may find that that's a common experience. And so like just kind of share like your experiences, right? Experiences with stigma, experiences with therapy, thoughts about therapy, thoughts about mental health, just your thoughts. Nevertheless, stay tuned for episode 4, and I look forward to continuously sharing information and just tuning in with everyone. And I just want to say shout out to everyone who has been commenting and just sharing insight into your experiences. It really does help. I've received feedback from people saying that, someone commented and it resonated with me. So you just never know the voice that you're sharing, how it can help someone else who may be voiceless at the moment. So thank you. Stay tuned. Don't forget to follow me at Bloom Speaking of Sunflower blog, and to continuously share this YouTube channel with everyone. As I always say, you may not take everything. The goal is to hopefully take something. So stay tuned and goodbye.